We've come a long way together, but I don't know that any of us can be exactly sure where we've arrived. And maybe that's in the nature of our enterprise. One of the philosophers we've looked at, Martin Heidegger, talks about the adventure of thinking and of philosophy is being on what is called a Holzweg, that is, a path in the woods. And the thing about those paths is that as you go on them and along them, you can't be sure that the particular one you're on at that particular time will open up to a wonderful and promising vista, or whether a particular Holzweg, a path in the woods that you take, for instance, on another time, might end in some kind of dead end, or you'd be lost. And I think whether you're a philosophy professor or someone that hasn't had the so-called professional training, each experience will be an experience that you have more than once. And if I knew you, I would probably find out that things that I myself might think of as dead ends, that you found to be extraordinary vistas, and things that I would think of as extraordinary vistas, you may have seen as dead ends. And I think that's the nature of the kind of conversation that we have. And maybe that's the essential human conversation beneath the roar, the excitement, the movement of the world that we live in and live through. It's wonderful to have a method. And if you have a method, you can have, hopefully, a predetermined goal. And the predetermined goal can determine how to get there and a way of knowing that you've arrived. But I think that as we've talked about meaning, we can't have been altogether sure that we've known just quite what we've been seeking. Now, we've wondered about the degree to which something called philosophy might help us. And I think it's good to remind ourselves that even philosophers themselves argue over what philosophy is, what philosophy can do, and in fact, some think that philosophy is best staying away from questions that can be as strenuous, as agonizing, and unsettling even as questions regarding the meaning of life. But be that as it may, what we ourselves have done in our time together is walked along a number of Holzwege, and different vistas have been open to us, and perhaps we've come to points along the way where we couldn't be sure how to continue or even where we had come. We're said to live now in a postmodern world, and this is something that has many implications for human life and for this strange activity called philosophy that might pretend to be a potential guide for human living. There's said in our time, as we have turned into the 21st century, to no longer be something we might call a grand meta-narrative. A grand meta-narrative would be something available that would orient us, a story of an overarching sort that we could use to place ourselves. And it's said by many that in the postmodern world in which we live, there is no such narrative, no compelling story in terms of which we can say where we are in our time, and therefore find the place where we might belong. That there is no such meta-narrative, that there's no narrative of the human adventure that can be articulated in a blueprint form, I think has suggested to many that history is not actually going anywhere except through the play of contending human forces, national, international, corporate, so on and so forth, and that in the midst of power struggles, accident, and luck come also to play a large, if not overwhelming, role in whatever happens to happen as the future course of history. There have, in fact, been 4 basic meta-narratives that we have seen and lived with as part of our Western heritage. One, I might call the Platonic Christian. It is the idea of life as a journey which could be construed in religious terms as to a kingdom of heaven, a place of a true belonging, and this life a pilgrimage to that place, or in more philosophical terms, that this world is not known well by us and it's a world of change, that we belong and our minds can be elevated and then we elevated to an unchanging realm where the very heightened use of our reason can find a dwelling for us. That's probably been the overarching narrative that has been most at work in the holding and unfolding of Western history. We've seen another view as well in Hegel of history as the unfolding of the consciousness of God, of history coming to an end. And the notion of that end is that every true idea has now been developed. As some of you might know, there's been a kind of variant of that came toward the end of the 20th century, when Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man, in which he said that in terms of history, if you consider it as the contention and playing out of political ideologies, that the sort of political ideology that we have, the democratic ideology, has prevailed. Now there could be a falling away from that, but if you mean by history arrival at what the best possible way of organizing ourselves is, we've arrived. We have arrived at the end of history. We've seen in Marx a notion of a potential revolution that Marx thought eventually would come and usher in a new era. And we have seen probably in disturbing ways philosophers like Nietzsche who have said to us, well, the underlying meta-narrative of history brings us to the realization that there is no beyond, and what meaning there can only be through activities through which creatively we shape a life for ourselves. What the postmodern view has claimed is that no foundations actually stand that would reliably support and guide human life. As I've mentioned, the notion of another world, of a providential kingdom of heaven, comes progressively by many to be doubted, and nature itself is construed as sufficiently malleable to be subject to often conflicting and competing scientific and technological opportunities and purposes, as if we could, as technology advances, make the very world we live in over, and potentially even make ourselves over. And this strange thing we have that the Greeks told us was what made us special as human beings, our reason, well, it comes to be construed largely in our time as either the very abstract sort of thing that lies at the basis of logic or metamathematics, or as a reason that's so embedded in diverse and conflicting and competing social practices that rather than this reason liberating us, it itself becomes, in its place in different social and cultural settings an instrument in which people argue with each other rather than communicate with each other. Our current situation with respect to human life and its guidance, possibly through something called philosophy, can now be seen as very, very challenging and, in fact, very complex. I think professional philosophy is a very important activity. At the same time, the professionalization of philosophy has led over time to its separation from those larger concerns and more central issues that are of a concern to everyone. Perhaps this is as it should be. We must consider that. Is this strange notion of meaning, is it something that we should approach in a private matter, and it should be left to the privacy of our own personal reflections? Or should we even consider it audacious and arrogant that anyone would talk about the meaning of life and pretend to offer a meaning of life that could be available through a particular person's insight to many people in many places? What happened in professional philosophy, a very, very significant enterprise that I don't wish in any way to depreciate, is that issues, for example, in the theory of knowledge, issues regarding the existence of the external world or the existence of other people, became paradigm-type issues to come to work on conceptually and to clarify. And it turned out that through advances in the sciences that we've seen over the last few hundred years, more and more domains have become available for empirical investigation. And that has actually raised a question within philosophy as to whether philosophy's technical subject matter, as the sciences progress more and more, linguistics, neuroscience progress more and more, is the subject matter of professional philosophy itself shrinking? Just as many have said that philosophy gave way to psychology at the turn into the 20th century, or philosophy gave way to science significantly at the time that people like Galileo arose on the scene. Well, one of the concerns philosophy has had is regarding the nature of the mind and its interior furniture. And it became one of the major interests of philosophers. And more recently, over the last 100 years or so, philosophers have been very concerned with how our language works and whether there is a kind of logic to our language that can be revelatory and help us get out of various conceptual tangles. Now, even if issues regarding the mind or our uses of language are resolved, very human questions unavoidably remain regarding how we're to live our lives and what we ought to do with them. And these probably aren't going to be solved by the wonderful activity, which I personally enjoy a great deal, which is reading the great dead philosophers, or even many of the living who may or may not be or come to be great. If you'll reflect back with me on where we've been and how we've traveled, let me remind you once again of this remark, so kind of charming and consoling to me, made by Niels Bohr, when he said that clarity and accuracy may not be possible at the same time, that probably one of the two is going to be sacrificed. Now, as it turns out, it could be the case that professional philosophy has tended to sacrifice accuracy to the complexity of the human situation to an extraordinary clarity. And I truly applaud that clarity. But I'm also a person living in the world, however well or badly trained in this field of philosophy, who is very concerned to think about whether life has a meaning, how to approach it, how to reflect on it. There was a famous remark made by Alfred North Whitehead. He collaborated with Bertrand Russell in the writing of a book called Principia Mathematica. And he was talking about what collaborations were like. And he said, well, Bertie, after all, it's Bertrand Russell, Bertie, most good collaborations involve the connecting of the simple-minded and the muddle-headed. Bertie, you're the simple-minded one. Now, I haven't had the opportunity actually to talk with you and listen to you. I think I've had to be my own collaborator, and I'll need to leave it to you to determine when I was the simple-minded collaborator and when I have been the muddle-headed one. But in any case, there's some measure of both in any philosophical reflection about life. Philosophy is born, and I think it continues to bear a complex relation to religion, especially in the institutionalized forms that religion takes. An important way that many have distinguished philosophy from religion is that philosophy, possibly at its best, raises questions, where perhaps religion at its very best has found a way to provide answers. But as we are turning into the 21st century, it is the case, as perhaps it's always been, but perhaps more so now, that we have to reflect on what the questions really are that we should be asking. That perhaps we have to be more concerned with finding better questions to ask rather than better answers to the questions that we already are concerned with. Answers, after all, can sometimes lose their force if the questions for which they provide answers have somehow been lost, muted, or superseded. On the other hand, questioning for its own sake can become all too quick and clever, and it can come to exist then more as a game than as a serious enterprise. There's probably at least some reason to believe that some aspects of religion, in its traditional forms, speak at least to some concerns we may no longer have or have in the way we used to have them. It may be that in some ways certain aspects of religion as we have known it, have we outgrown them? Perhaps not. Have we lost touch with them? Maybe that's closer to saying how it is. Obviously, this is a very controversial thing even to explore. And remember, I said at the beginning of our time together that there will be all kinds of thoughts to consider, and they can be considered in different ways. And what I've hoped to do with you is myself consider them in different ways. Sometimes perhaps simple-mindedly, other times muddle-headedly. There's a case to be made, and we've glanced at it and occasionally dwelled with it, that in fact the issues that concern us as humans are less regarding death and less regarding issues of moral guilt, and that we've moved into an era in which the presence, or perhaps the absence of meaning, has become the central concern. But it's a very strange time for this to have happened, because if you think about it, we are undergoing now what could be construed as a biotechnological revolution. And there are extraordinary biotechnological opportunities in our future. As we pass further into the 21st century, a lot of the things that we might say are going to look less like science fiction, and they're going to become actual possibilities. And they will raise major questions regarding what it means to be human and I think you're quite aware of the sorts of things I'm talking about: cloning, partial replacement of our cells, enhancement of our cells. And if you realize that if we told people who we could bring back to life who had lived 100 years ago what life is like now, they would think of that as science fiction. And here we are with all these extraordinary things. And it's most likely the case that if we were told what biotechnology just in itself will be able to do 100 years from now, we would see that as visionary science fiction that would stagger us for its extraordinary fictional quality. Probably what's needed, and hopefully we will nurture a concern to develop an understanding of it better, is a notion of human nature that will allow us to distinguish between preventive and remedial work with respect to ourselves and certain forms of the enhancement of the human that could possibly transform the human into something that it's never been before, that we can't anticipate. Now, we know it's the case that for some, a Darwinist type of account could render a fixed notion of human nature no longer plausible, and moot the distinction between what is remedial and what is enhancing. It's conceivable the time will come when we'll live in a very brave and a very new world. But as we stand now, it might be a world that would be so strange to us that from where we stand today, it's virtually unimaginable. Quite clearly, if we're to be frank about it, enhancement possibilities of human nature, driven by technological advances, will probably be largely first and mostly available to the economically privileged. But it's said also by many that medical opportunities and ways in which medicine more generally may deal with us will come to compete for dominance with traditional theological doctrines as the 21st century progresses. There are going to be efficiency and enhancement considerations that could bring it about that a quite artificial means, well, it's nearly here or is here, artificial means of reproduction, nurturing, and education will become the much preferred means of human development. In fact, that's an extraordinary thought. Perhaps philosophy professors could be produced on an assembly line by a coming computer company. Well, no, that actually is quite a thought, but I'm not going to dwell with it now in my few remaining minutes with you. Questions will unavoidably be raised concerning whether, in fact, death itself may not be avoidable in principle, and whether human life might continue to have meaning in an entirely different kind of environment, and it might come under a technologically controlled environment to have a kind of meaning that might diminish us and that we would, as we lived through it, regret. In any case, we do live at an extraordinary threshold with respect to our human situation. There are questions that we can't help but ask. What parts of our past, what parts of our intellectual, cultural, spiritual heritage should we reflect back upon and hope to recuperate, hope to nurture, hope to be sure remain always with us? We don't want our past simply to become part of something called the history of ideas. But also, how might we cultivate an openness toward the future, but an openness that's quite realistic, that that future will not only involve through technology, progress, and an easier life, that it may equally involve through technology a different sense of what it is to be human. how in a thoughtful way can we reorient ourselves toward an open and increasingly controversial and contentious and contended technological and spiritual future? How can we bring that about? There are even those who have written recently about something that is called the end of philosophy. Now, as you can imagine, that disturbs philosophy professors to hear that talked about. A reason some have talked about the end of philosophy is because it has been thought by some that philosophy only exists in the grand sense if you can construe life as a journey, and if, however metaphorically, you understand that journey as traveling in a way that brings you into a new and different dimension, if only it's a new and different way of experiencing the very world in which you find yourself. Others have thought that the end of philosophy might come, and this has to do more with professional philosophy, a highly kind of excellent pursuit for gifted people whose conceptual abilities are extraordinary. Some people have thought that the end of philosophy will come because linguistics, cognitive science, neuroscience, all kinds of specific scientific disciplines will advance and advance in such a way that we'll come to believe that the traditional technical problems of philosophy about the mind and the body, for instance, or how we're sure we know that there are other people, that various advances will bring it about that those questions will be answered. Well, any of this is possible. We can't know. But surely there's a sense in which philosophy could never end. And that's the sense in which, so long as we live, and as we give any thought as to why we might be here, or what to do with what sometimes we think the accident of our being here, we are invariably going to ask ourselves, is there, could there be, might I at least create a meaning for life? And insofar as philosophy continues also to get understood as a pursuit of the art of living, and insofar as philosophy continues to allow itself also to be understood as providing guidance for living, often conflicting guidance, guidance that involves arguments about whether history has a meaning, arguments about whether we have an authentic personhood, arguments about whether there is continuing despair in human life and what it means, arguments that continue about whether anxiety is a pathological thing to be removed or a symptom and a sign that we're more than we think we are most of the time. As long as those phenomena remain within us, there is a future for and in philosophy. From the Hebrew Bible, I believe it's from the book of Job, there is the following phrase: "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." We stand at a point where we are taking the wings of a morning which it is too early for us to see what kind of a day it will be. That is the 21st century into which we have now come. What I've hoped that we've been able to do together on our journey together is dwell a bit in the depths of a certain kind of sea, a sea of ideas, of concerns, of reflections on whether there truly are deep things in life, and if there are, how to reach them, and if we can reach them, whether philosophy is a helpful guide to reaching them. Thank you so much.